All right, welcome everyone to another one of our Maryland Robotics Center seminar series for the fall of 2024. So we actually, after this, we only have one more left. So I see some people shedding tears already, but it's going to happen. So I'm really, really excited. So we have Nick Gravish from the University of California, San Diego with us today. And so Professor Gravish is from the Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering Department at UCSD. He received his Ph.D. from Georgia Tech in 2013 and was a postdoc at Harvard from 2013 to 2016. And he has several recent awards, including the NSF Career Award, as well as an NSF EFRI on soft robotics. And so here we go. Awesome. Welcome.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for all for coming. It's gorgeous outside right now. So
your microphone's muted?
I applaud you all for coming to this room with no windows and staying here with me for an hour. So I am from UCSD. I'll also just highlight, Ryan got to see the new building that we're in. It's very cool.
It is incredible.
If anybody happens to be traveling through San Diego, send me an email and we can show you around. I think if you ask people from the general public about what their thoughts about robotics are, we're often sort of drawn to pictures of robots that are working in extremely structured environments, have very precisely controlled motion, work in known sort of settings with known perturbations, and they're extremely good at very individual tasks. I actually don't have a background in robotics until my postdoc. I came up through thinking about living systems and working with collectives like ants and other organisms that have to deal with challenging locomotion tasks, move in complicated worlds, have very limited communication capabilities. And so this kind of like background really structures what I look for in working with robotics. I'm interested in things that can work in unstructured environments and display adaptive and kind of robust capabilities. And so in my talk today, I want to talk about three different aspects from the research topics that are in my lab, all focused around adaptivity. So adaptivity being the ability to kind of learn, react, respond to perturbations, both internally and externally. And we're going to talk about these in sort of three different contexts. Structural contexts like compliance, dynamic contexts like feedback loops that have sort of emergent dynamics, and collectives that interact through contact. These are just a subset of the things that we work on in my lab. Namely, like I just said, compliance is one of the themes of the things that we work on in my lab. Compliance has the inherent ability to adapt. Soft structures can change their shape in response to contact with objects in the world that maybe are unanticipated. And we can use compliance to kind of make robots adaptive with less control. And there's a very, I think, emerging and interesting area of soft robotics that is exploiting compliance. Similarly, I'm interested in dynamic systems from a dynamical systems perspective. These systems have adaptive capabilities all through sort of underlying dynamics that don't necessarily come from programming in those behaviors, but come from the kind of emergence of those behaviors from the connection of interconnecting sensory motor systems. And I'm fundamentally really interested in systems that interact through contact. Collective behaviors where the robots or the animals are all in really close proximity, and the kind of interactions are really mediated by mechanical interactions like bumping into each other, and exploring kind of how we can design systems that take advantage of those kinds of interactions. The first topic that I want to talk about is using kind of compliance in structures to make robots that can change their shape, that can modulate their behavior, and that can do this in sort of adaptive ways. And the first way that we thought about doing this was by using and exploiting material curvature to change the compliance of the body of a robot. And by changing curvature, then we can change the local compliance that exists in a robot. You all probably have experience with how curvature controls compliance. A paper roll tube has high strength, but if I put a bend in a paper roll tube and make the cross-section flat, I now have something that has a very low bending resistance, and I can make a functional joint in a robot. And we kind of envision that by using tubular structures and changing the local curvature of those tubular structures, we can make robots that can reconfigure their sort of kinematics of their body, as well as reconfigure the compliant properties of their body for different types of tasks. And so truly, like, the example of this is just pinching tubes. We worked on these reconfigurable pinch tube mechanisms, first kind of exploring different types of ways a tube can create a joint, if you will, like a functional joint, or it can create a structural element where the circular cross-section gives that part of the tube structure. And the question that we asked was, how can we reconfigure the bends that exist in these tubes so that we can reconfigure the types of joints that we can create in a tube? And my student came up with a method where if you've ever taken like a flexible tube, I imagine that everybody's done this, and you pull a vacuum in it, it's going to buckle. So by pulling a vacuum in a flexible tube, you create a buckle. But the problem is that buckle will happen just anywhere where there's some kind of low resistance of bending in the tube. So to control the location of that buckle, by putting a cuff on the tube, and that cuff right there has a slightly oval shape to it, and then rearranging the arrangement of that oval, you can control exactly where you create these pinch tubes, and you can control the location and the orientation of a flexible joint. Flexible joints are like the underlying structure to serial linkages and robotic linkages. And so by being able to change and reconfigure the locations of these joints, we could explore how we can make different kinds of combinations of these pinch joints to make different arrangements of serial linkages that could be completely reconfigured. The material that they're formed from is soft inherently. It's a soft 3D printed TPU to be exact. But by pulling the vacuum, we create a very soft location, and by keeping a circular cross-section in other areas, we maintain structure. And so we use this to make what we thought were, sort of really interesting, simple reconfigurations of serial linkages for robot tails that we used for little flapping and swimming robots. We wanted to expand on this because right now, in this implementation, these joints are unactuated. They're being pushed on by a student. This is just showing two different configurations of these, by the way, one in which the two joints are configured in the same axis, one where they're orthogonal. But to actuate these systems required a whole kind of re-envisioning of this problem. And we designed internal modules that could move within an inflated tube, so now not pulling a vacuum but inflating, and these modules were able to relocate within the tube, change the axis that they're going to form a joint, and then actuate that joint at that location. So the idea that I have an inflatable tube, I have modules within that inflatable tube that can move to any desired location. They can create a joint axis at any angle, and then they can actuate up to plus minus 90 degrees within that at that location. And the idea is that this is all exploiting the kind of structural properties that tubes give us. That inflated tubes or that structural tubes like the TPU one that I showed you before have high cross-sectional area, high stiffness, and sort of provide structure to a body. Whereas when I pinch that tube and put a bend in it, I can create local regions that are relatively weak and that we can bend and use for actuation of joints and reconfiguration of joints as well. There's a ton of demos associated with this that I don't have time to show, but we made little walking robots that basically walk by rolling their limbs and paddling themselves across the ground. These are all untethered in the sense that they all have their own Wi-Fi module, they have their own battery, they have their own communication systems, and they can move and relocate and reconfigure for specific locomotion tasks. And so that's just one example of using curvature where we can change the local curvature of a structure to change the properties of the joint associated with it. This is all work that sort of emerged from the EFRI project. It's somewhat a little older, but finally saw the light of day. But another area of sort of where curvature and materials and mechanics interact that I'm really excited about is the following. I'm sure everybody's used a tape measure before. If you haven't, you should. They're pretty fun. Tape measures have a really interesting structural property. If you've ever played with one, they are soft when you bend them, and they can create reconfigurable locations of a bent joint. but they're pretty strong. And if you push against the direction of curvature, you actually make a pretty strong beam. Tape measures can be rolled up into a very small, like compact shape, right? I can put 25 feet of a spool of tape measure in a very small area. And so we wanted to see how we could also use curvature in the context of tape measures, where the curvature is what's providing the strength to the overall structure, to make manipulators. The manipulator overall concept looks like the following. Imagine that I can motorize spools of tape measures. So now I can make arms that can extend out. I can make two of those so that I've got a bent shape, like this triangular shape that we show up there. That provides the ability to grab objects with much more strength than an individual. And since I have 25 feet of spooled tape within there, I can do really interesting manipulation kinematics, all from the fact that the curvature of the cross-section when it's in its ovalized shape is quite strong. But at the flattened shape where we form this buckle bend, it's extremely low resistance. I can do this basically free to reconfigure that location. And this is a first version of this. You'll see it's truly a tape measure. And what's really cool is that we can do, like I said, these kind of interesting kinematic manipulations where, for instance, by unspooling tape on one side and spooling tape in on the other side, we can keep an object in place and rotate it. And again, we can do this over large rotations because we got a ton of tape that is spooled up. We can convey objects. We can convey individual objects or multiple objects. Again, this is using these super lightweight structures where the strength is all coming from the intrinsic curvature of the material. It's inherently a soft device, right? If I slam it into something, it just buckles and bends out of the way. It adapts its shape to local perturbations. I want to say that in a sort of overly academic way. But we can smash this thing into stuff, into walls, and it doesn't break because the underlying material is relatively soft. So it has all these kind of properties of what we think of in soft robotics as being advantageous. It will not hurt somebody when you're interacting with it. It is inherently soft, so it's very hard to break, but it has enough strength to perform the kind of tasks that we're interested in. We can store up a lot of spooled tape to extend these things out to long distances. And we can do very fine-scale manipulation with it. This is all teleoperated, I should say, by the way. The graduate student working on this is driving these around. So this is an example of picking grapes. By watching the curvature of the bent end, you can estimate what the contact forces are. We've since put force sensors on this so that we can actually do force feedback. These are just examples of this twisting motion, which I think is really unique to this structure. And again, if you put enough tape in there, you can twist for many, many rotations. You have to have a light bulb turning on in some of these demos, right? Everybody has a soft robot hand that turns on a light bulb, so we had to do that. Reviewers who, maybe some of you were out there, complain that this is just planar and so it's not that interesting. And so in an effort to address that, we have built a smaller version of this that has multiple extruders, so it has the same kind of kinematic capabilities as the previous one. But now we can put this on a robot arm. And by putting it on a robot arm, we can now interact with more interesting types of objects. So this is a jalapeno plant. You go to Home Depot and you want to buy a plant that has fruit on it at that time so that you can do your demos. Nobody sells cherry tomato plants that have fruit on the vine. You got to grow that from scratch, but jalapeno plants are very easy to buy, so here's a jalapeno plant. But this just demonstrates that we can now make this small enough so that we can still achieve the same kind of manipulation capabilities, but we can do it in a 3D context. And I think this has a really nice advantage to maybe some other manipulation methods because the tapes are extremely compact, but they can extend out to very long lengths. I should say for this, we don't have 25 feet of tape. We've got something more like 5 feet of tape, which means about 2.5 feet of extension since it's a triangular shape. These tapes can reach into cluttered environments. They have a kind of soft contact. When you pinch things, you're pinching things through the bend of this tape, and that bend of that tape acts basically like a soft spring. And so we can do really interesting manipulation capabilities with this, all inherently derived from what I think are the amazing properties of these tape springs. And tape springs have been used a lot in space applications for deployable structures and for like structural elements of lightweight trusses. But we haven't seen them used in this kind of application where they're used as the actual structural member of the manipulator, but also the contact surface that the manipulator is using to interact with objects. This is going to, I think, uncap a pepper jar and then pour out the pepper. The kinematics of this system are fairly easy to write down mathematically. You basically just have a triangular shape. The only uncertainty is what the radius of curvature of the bend is. When it's unloaded, the radius of curvature that bend makes is exactly the radius of curvature of the tape itself. That's not something that we've shown. People who've studied these structures have shown this before. And so you basically have a problem where you've got a sort of quasi-triangle, and you're just trying to locate the vertices of the quasi-triangle by changing the rate of change of the length on the left and right side of the triangle. There are 4 inputs for the length of the tape, and then there's a width control of the middle jaws as well. And then in this, it's sitting on a robot arm, so it has all the 6 degree of freedom capabilities beyond that. Underwater. Okay, we'll move on from this. So this has been a really fun project, and this is just I think a kind of little appetizer for how curvature can be used in robotics to change the structural properties of a robot manipulator. In the first example, that was by using the kind of change in material or mechanical properties that happen when you create a pinch in a tube. And in the second case, it's what happens when you create a flat bend in an ovalized structure. In both cases, we're sort of modulating, or using rather the modulation of the stiffness that happens by changing the cross-sectional curvature to create what we think are interesting and useful either locomotors or manipulators. This is also, I think, a plea for looking around and finding creative inspiration by what's around you. We literally were just playing with tape measures and we thought, what can we do with this? And we extended it out and started pushing things around on the table. And we thought, wow, this is maybe an interesting application of using these extendable tapes as like manipulating type structures. And that led to a very interesting whole platform of research. I'm going to make a hard transition, apologies all, to the second area that I'm interested in. And I told you I'm transitioning from tape measures to bees now. I told you I come from a world of looking at insects as inspiration for robotics. So this is an area of research that is associated with dynamical systems and the inherent adaptive capabilities of dynamical systems that we want to use to build robots that can adapt to their environments or adapt to changing properties of their own body. This work comes from a long collaboration that I've had with, I guess I should show it up here, a group at Georgia Tech who are true insect flight biologists and study the physiology of muscles and things like that. But it's inherently a collaborative process of trying to understand what the underlying mechanics of how insects generate their flapping wings work. And I'll show you robots at the end of this that use all these principles. If you've never thought about the way an insect flies, that's great. I think you should. It's really interesting. Insects generate their flapping wing beats through pairs of muscles that are in their body. A muscle that causes the wing to go in the downstroke and a muscle that causes the wing to move in the upstroke. And these muscles are pulling against their elastic body. They've got an insect skeleton that has elastic material in it. The elastic material resolin was discovered in the insect's exoskeleton, and resolin is the most energy efficient, or rather resilient material that has been found in biology. It restores something like 99% of the elastic energy under stretching. So there's these very good, for lack of a better word, elastic materials in the body of the insect. And the muscles excite resonant flapping by pulling against the body at a specific frequency that causes wings to flap in an energetically efficient way. And we can write down a very simple like harmonic oscillator model for this, which says forces come into the exoskeleton through the muscles. They cause elastic forces, inertial forces, and aerodynamic forces to resist that. And now you have like basically a kind of oscillatory mechanical structure. But there's something interesting that you see if you look at the biological world. There's two ways that insects generate the flight actuation. And if you've ever thought about how periodic forcing gets created, there's sort of two ways that we generate periodic motion. The first way is I generate a sinusoidal force that goes to my spring mass system, and that causes it to get excited and flap at a specific frequency that is the exact frequency that I tell it to flap at, right? Or I tell it to move at. Your simple like spring mass damper system that I'm driving with a sinusoidal frequency. And that's what happens in insects that have low flapping wing frequencies like moths, butterflies, locusts. The muscle, every time it contracts, is contracting under a signal from the brain that is firing every 20 times a second in the case of moths, that's causing it to oscillate. And this is a synchronous mode of oscillation. But insects that have faster wing beats like mosquitoes, bees, flies, they have wing beats in the hundreds of hertz. And so they've evolved a sort of different way to generate wing beats. It's what's called asynchronous actuation in the biological literature. And what it means is if you look at this sort of oscillating signal here that is sort of corresponding to the wing beats, the muscle is only activated from the brain once every tens of wing beats. And so for many wing beats, the brain is completely out of the loop. And it's just what's called a delayed stretch activation reflex in the muscle itself that causes it to oscillate. What this means is that the brain is basically not driving, not telling the wings to flap at a certain frequency. The frequency is completely emergent. It's dictated by the elasticity of the body, the aerodynamic forces, all that kind of stuff. And what's really cool is it provides all these adaptive capabilities to insects that I'll show you a little bit later on, such that, just like a harmonic oscillator will change its frequency if I change the mass that it's oscillating, the same thing happens with these insects. And so this asynchronous actuation produces what are called limit cycles. And if you think of from a nonlinear dynamics context, they're oscillations that are not driven by any kind of periodic forcing. They're driven by a specific feedback process within the body. Delayed stretch activation is interesting in that it's basically, if I take a muscle and I pull on it, after a short amount of time, it generates a force that wants to contract back. That's where the delay in the term delayed stretch activation comes from. Stretch activation means I have to pull on it and stretch it before it will generate a force to contract back. We're all familiar with like a dash pot, right? If I take a dash pot and I pull on it with a specific velocity, it pulls against me with a force that's proportional to that velocity. Delayed stretch activation is like take a dash pot and now delay the response of the dash pot. So I pull on my dash pot and a short time later it pulls back against me with a force that's proportional to the velocity that I pulled with. When we induce delays in systems, that induces instabilities, which induce oscillations, and that's exactly what's going on here. You've got this process where the muscles are pulling against each other, they're exciting each other through this limit cycle type process, and they're creating the oscillations. We've dug into the literature and came up with a system model of delayed stretch activation. We then coupled this delayed stretch activation model of insect muscle to the model of the thorax that we had previously developed and that came from measurements from hawk moths and bumblebees. And we found that when you couple the delayed stretch activation process of the flight muscle to the spring mass dynamics of the body, you get exactly what you might expect. You get a process where in some parameter space regimes, oscillations will grow in the system, and the system is unstable and wants to flap. And this is just a sort of spectrum of the like stable and unstable modes of the system. If I increase the rate of this delayed stretch activation on the x-axis, meaning I have a sort of faster response in the muscle, it becomes stable and I won't have wing beats. But if the muscle is too slow, I say too slow is a bad thing, it's actually a good thing. If the muscle is slow in its response and I pull on it and it takes a while for it to contract back, then it will excite oscillations. And oscillations in this context mean they're an instability of the sort of stationary mode where the wings don't flap. Instability is often thought of as not good, but in this case, instability is good. We want to excite instabilities in the system so we get flapping. So what is really cool is when you build systems that have these kind of properties, they have the spring mass dynamics of the body, they have the stretch activation properties of the actuator, and you put them together, you get very adaptive flapping that can respond instantaneously to perturbations to the body or to through the external environment, collisions with the environment, changes in aerodynamics, things like that. We built a big dynamically scaled system to study kind of the fluid mechanics of this process. Rather, I shouldn't say fluid mechanics because there's true fluid mechanists in the audience, but we built this to emulate the fluid mechanics that insect wings experience, and that also embody the kind of sort of springiness of the exoskeleton by building these torsional springs. We actuate the system through torque control so that we can exactly prescribe like delayed stretch activated dynamics to the system. And to just give you an example of what I mean by instability here, if we set up the system in this mode here where on the y-axis is kind of the magnitude of the stretch activation response, on the x-axis is the speed of the stretch activation response. If we make the magnitude of the stretch activation response relatively low, then when I go in and I ping the system, which is shown in this plot here, it oscillates a little bit, but those oscillates decay away. If I increase the magnitude of the delayed stretch activated response, meaning my force that I pull back under a stretch, I see that when I ping the system, I get slightly larger oscillations. But if I move into this unstable regime, I see that I get emergent oscillations, and the system will oscillate with a relatively high wing beat and a relatively frequency, rather, that is completely dictated by the mechanics of the system, by the inertia of the wings, the aerodynamics of the wings, the spring stiffness, and then the properties of the muscle as well. So, our whole takeaway so far is that many insects that you see flying around aren't controlling their wing beats on a beat-by-beat cycle. They're generating wing beats through an emergent process that's just happening within the muscle. And you can, take out the brain from the system. You can take the muscle out of the body. These are amazing experiments that were done in the 60s. Hook it up to a mechanical spring, and the system will oscillate spontaneously. So this muscle wants to spontaneously oscillate. And we want to use that to generate kind of adaptive responses in these flapping wing systems. So what does an adaptive response mean? Well, one example is imagine that I have a wing flapping and all of a sudden I instantaneously change the inertia of the wing. We set this system up, or this experiment up in our system. At a time t star, we drop a plate onto the wing. That changes the inertia. And what you see is that there's a near instantaneous response of the system to adapt to a lower frequency and a higher amplitude in this case. We did this for a number of different changes of inertia to the system, and also by changing the size and shape of the wing as well. And what we saw is a result that pretty much exactly matched the results that people in the insect flight literature have shown. On the y-axis here is 1 over the emergent frequency squared of the system, and on the x-axis is the wing inertia. Inertia and frequency are related by the square root of 1 over inertia, so a straight line, there's just the resonant dynamics. So a straight line just means the system changes to a new frequency, which is exactly the new resonant frequency of the system, right? It's exactly like I have a spring mass system that's oscillating, and I do the experiment where I drop a mass on it. All of a sudden, it's going to change its resonant frequency. I think that's really cool because there's no sensors involved here, right? It's not like the robot, or it's not like the insects are using some sensory processes that are going through the brain that are saying, I've now, experienced a dramatic change in my, let's say, wing area because I hit something and broke my wing. Instead, it's the underlying actuator's properties and the kind of proprioceptive capabilities of that actuator that are providing these like instantaneous responses. And there's so much literature on the insect flight frequency where people take insect wings and they clip them and they measure the emergent frequency of flapping. And this just shows, again, The same plot that we're showing for our case here, delayed stretch activation produces these kinds of emergent properties where the brain and the sensory systems aren't involved in sort of dictating what the emergent frequency is. It's just the inherent properties of the muscle and the body. Another cool behavior that we observed during my postdoc, I was working with insect flight biologists doing things like this. You can't see this, but there's a tripwire here, I should say. I'm pointing over here, but there's a tripwire there. It's a thin fishing line, and this bee flying back to its nest runs into it. And what do we see? It's flapping its wings at like 180 hertz. It hits right here. Within about 2 to 3 wing beats, the wing beat is completely stopped, and then it starts again. That time scale is faster than most sensory motor time scales. And what's happening here is that the wing beat is stopping because a muscle needs a stretch to be actuated. If I stop it from stretching, there's no more actuation. So if I have a muscle that is being stretched and then it's creating an activation force based on its prior stretch, as soon as I halt that stretch, I halt the actuation. And so you have here now a system where responses to collisions happen very quickly, but they don't happen through sensory processes. They happen through the limit cycle dynamics of the system and the inherent adapted properties of that. We set up, again, a very simple experiment. Stop our wing, see what happens. Wing collides with an object. It stops immediately. You ping the wing again, and it starts up again. This is all fine and good. We've been doing this in these big water tank experiments, and I think I've demonstrated most of what we think are really cool adaptive properties that people have demonstrated in insect flight within our robot. But we actually wanted to make a robot that could fly using these principles and show that we can, if we run this robot into a wall, it will stop flapping because of the delayed stretch activation process. It will start flapping again when it gets a kick, et cetera, et cetera. And so very recently, all kind of unpublished and I think really cool stuff we've been working on are small DC motor driven robots that use delayed stretch activation to flap their wings. We use DC motors because they're easy to work with than the small piezoelectric motors. We use DC motors also because DC motors have an inherent proprioceptive capability. When they rotate, they create back EMF. Back EMF is proportional to velocity if you've ever worked with motors. So a motor is inherently a sensor as well as an actuator. So we can actuate the motor and at the same time be sensing what the velocity is. And the velocity, the stretch, if you will, is what creates the actuation. So we set up these DC motors just with the feedback loop that is emulating the delayed stretch activation process. And we get nice, robust limit cycle oscillations. This plot just shows here the wing angle and the wing velocity. And if anybody remembers from nonlinear dynamics phase space of an oscillator is basically a nice circular trajectory where it just, the state evolves at a constant rate. So we're able to generate nice, robust limit cycles from these flapping wings. But working with this system kind of highlighted a really interesting challenge that we came across that we realized biology is kind of solved in a really interesting way. The conundrum occurs because delayed stretch activation is paired up among muscles on the left and right side of the body. And so insects in our motors are individually driving the left and right side of the wings through this kind of limit cycle process. The problem then becomes, how do I make the wings synchronize? Because the brain is not involved in generating the wing beats, it's just through the kind of stretch relaxation process. Insects evolved a way to do this, which is literally a physical structure in their body that couples the left-right sides of the wings. And biologists have shown that if you deconnect the left-right side of the thorax, the wings go out of phase because the wings don't know about each other. They're not talking to each other through any sort of brain-based neural communication. They're just responding mechanically to whatever the locomotion of the wing is and the stretch. So there's a very literal physical structure that synchronizes the wings. And we came across the same problem, that if you drive two DSA motors, well, they're just going to be moving at whatever phase and frequency they're acting at because they're only responding to their local movement and they're generating limit cycle oscillations based on just their individual motions. So inspired by the way that insects do it, we came up with a very simple physical structure that coupled these, just elastic tendons, if you will. Just the presence of these two elastic strings that will stretch if the wings go out of phase causes very robust coupling among these wings. So, I mean, it's just a physical process of synchronizing these wings. And what's really cool is that by using elastic structures, and I don't have time to show you, unfortunately, if you make one wing collide with an object, the other wing is unimpeded, but stays synchronized between the two wings. So it's a very robust way to synchronize these things that doesn't require any electrical communication between the wings. In the insects, it doesn't require any kind of nervous system communication between the muscles, but provides this very robust synchronization mechanism that if you change the cross-sectional area of one side of the one of the wings, you still maintain synchrony. When you change the cross-sectional area of the wings, you drive one of the systems to be at a slightly different frequency, but because of all the nice properties of synchronization, you get this nice, tightly coupled, synchronized flapping that persists over lots of different kinds of perturbations. And lastly, we wanted to demonstrate flight with this. So this is this robot here in a little flight arena. We're just demonstrating takeoff flight. We're not demonstrating any kind of controlled motion or anything like that. We're using stabilizing air dampers to stabilize this. And this is what this process looks like. The wing beats here are about 25 hertz. They're much lower than bees. But this is all being driven, again, through this kind of like self-excited feedback process. Mechanical structures are synchronizing the motion of the wings. And it's capable to fly and hopefully soon be controlled. But I think this process, this sort of limit cycle process of actuating these robots highlights what I think are really cool adaptive and responsive behaviors that we see in insect flight that we have attributed now and demonstrated that the delayed stretch activation process in the insect flight muscle is responsible for a lot of these kind of robust adaptive behaviors. Adapting frequency to match the resonance of the system, responding to perturbations very quickly, like collisional perturbations. And it's all without having sensory motor sort of higher level control processes. It's happening kind of through the actuation properties of the muscle itself in biology and in our kind of emulation of that muscle property in our motors. Sorry, 1 second. Like I said, this has been a long-term collaboration with insect flight physiologists and such, Simon Sponberg at Georgia Tech, and it's been a really fun collaboration. And I think hopefully highlights kind of my interest in nonlinear dynamics and the abilities of nonlinear dynamical systems to generate very robust emergent behavior and adaptive behavior. The last topic in my potpourri of topics that I'm going to talk about is synchronization, but in a different context. I'm very interested in systems that interact through contact. Swarms of robots that are in close proximity that push against each other and do interesting things. I don't know, 4 years ago I read a really interesting paper. Not by me. I have no affiliation with the authors, but the paper just fascinated me. If you take two worms, C. elegans, a very commonly studied worm, and you put them in close proximity in a pipette, they will synchronize their gait. They have a swimming gait, and if they're in close proximity, they synchronize. The authors were able to turn off all touch sensing in the worms. We have like huge genetic capabilities with C. elegans, and I can basically make them not know that they're touching anything, and they still synchronize their gait. And the authors basically claimed that it was steric hindrance is the dominant factor responsible for motion synchronization. Steric hindrance is an annoyingly academic term for contact. My body can't move through yours, we make contact with each other. And so I also knew that the way that C. elegans generate their oscillation is what's called a reflex chain, that basically they've got stretch receptors in their body. So if I bend my body up top, a stretch receptor just down the length of my body senses that stretch and responds by actuating, which causes another sort of chain reaction effect of actuation that propagates a bend down the body. People have done cool experiments where if you pinch a C. elegans right here, it'll oscillate up here, but the oscillations stop down here because you stop the stretch of the body. So this led me to limit cycles, which is a chain reaction of oscillation, and contact interactions that are happening between systems that lead to synchronization. And my hypothesis was truly these systems that generate oscillations through limit cycle type actuation, like I just showed you with the flapping wings, but also interact through contact, may be able to coordinate their behaviors without any kind of communication among the group, but just through the physics of contact and the physics of limit cycles. There's a huge literature on synchrony. If you haven't heard of like the Millennium Bridge problem, people walking across the Millennium Bridge, excited instabilities and made this thing shake a lot. I think actually that work was done here by Ed Ott, if I will. There's, you know, wonderful, beautiful nonlinear dynamics of synchrony. There's not a whole lot of discussion of contacting systems in synchrony. And so I want to just give you a kind of like simple overview of the way we thought about this problem and what we were able to do with it. And so this is just going to like show us two harmonic oscillators that are oscillating where the trajectories here are the phase of the oscillator that is evolving at a constant rate. Harmonic oscillators, spring mass systems, move sinusoidally. Their velocity is like a cosine, their position's a sine, that draws out a circle. That circle evolves uniformly in time. If they're not coupled together, then their phases never change with respect to each other, and their phase difference is always just a constant. If I put them in contact with each other, though, with just a little coefficient of restitution, meaning they lose a little energy, what happens is that just through contact, their phases get closer together and they synchronize. Right? This is like this simple thought experiment demonstration that maybe we're on the right track, that the worms are synchronizing because they're excited through a kind of limit cycle, and maybe we can adapt this for robots to coordinate their behavior. We went through a whole process of doing all this sort of analysis of this system. We understand that spring mass systems are passive systems. They lose energy. If you take energy out, they don't return to their constant amplitude. Limit cycle systems are oscillations that have constant energy input, constant energy dissipation, so they always want to drive to a constant amplitude. And so we wanted to build a system that modeled the way worms are generating their undulation through limit cycles, and see if contact interactions in that case will drive them into synchrony. And so we built the simplest robot you could imagine. It's just two motors that are driven as limit cycles, so they're just driven with a feedback process that makes them oscillate, but they have to contact each other. And what we did is we did way too many experiments because, I don't know, we wanted to explore the full parameter space. We showed that there's a very rich set of dynamics here, but that contact, synchronization through contact is pretty much guaranteed over a huge range of parameters. We could do some complex analysis to demonstrate this, and I encourage you to take a look at the papers associated with this. But basically, you can provably show that two limit cycle oscillators are going to synchronize, and the parameters that control that synchronization is just how much energy loss do you get at contact. All that's really cool. This was a very sort of academic study, but the question is like, when the rubber meets the road, how does this apply to robotics? And so I challenged my student, can we actually take now these ideas of limit cycle actuation and contact and put them into robots to make robots that'll synchronize their gates? A robot to us in this case was the simplest worm we could imagine, a three-link robot with two joints. We actuated it as a phase oscillator, meaning it's got some sort of natural frequency that it wants to follow and it's trying to follow. And then it's only responding to disturbances to its own joint motion. There's no contact sensors on this robot. They're just responding to their own local changes in joint angle. But we were able to generate the right kind of feedback control so that when you put these robots together, we can controllably, just with a single parameter, make groups of them synchronize, in the case of this sort of second bottom plot here, where four of them in close proximity, just through interacting with each other through contact, not through any kind of sensing externally, are synchronizing their gait. And then we can play around with this factor to cause them to desynchronize, as in the top case. The bottom case is sort of an example where we're actually inhibiting the oscillations. And we decided to try and do the worm experiment, where now these are robots that have little angled sort of snakeskin-like features on their bottom. They're not talking to each other through electrical communication. They're just watching their own oscillatory phase, and they're responding to that oscillatory phase based on collisions with the environment or with themselves. And they synchronize their gates, all through contact, all through driving these systems through these like very low-level adaptive limit cycle processes. The last example of this that I wanted to demonstrate, or that my student wanted to demonstrate rather, is the following. Can we make groups of robots team up together and synchronize their gates to push heavy objects? And so we did the same process of putting in adaptive controllers that basically will change the phase and slow down the phase based off of, slow down your oscillatory phase based off of interactions with the environment. If I push against something, I slow down a little bit. And an example of this is if I take two of these robots that walk through this kind of limit cycle type walk, and when there's no coupling between them, no object between them, they walk with a phase that never changes, or phase difference that never changes. But if I put an object in front of them, very quickly what's going to happen is that they're going to synchronize their pushing gate. Again, this all happens emergently through the kind of dynamics that we set up in the controller for the robot and the dynamics of contact. We set up a more experimental test bed for this with robots pushing along a linear rail, so we didn't have to worry about any kind of like two-dimensionality. The bottom plot here is showing the phase of the individual robots, and what you see is that the phase all start to come in alignment. They're synchronizing their gates through pushing common objects. You can do this in simulation with hundreds of robots and show sort of the same thing, that by being slowed down when I'm pushing an object, my neighbor can catch up to me because it hasn't hit the object yet. That's the basic process. But again, you can design the kind of principles of feedback for these so that you can make these robots synchronize their gates really, really well and really quickly. By synchronizing their gates, they can push objects further distances, they can push heavier objects, and it all happens through just this contact interaction through an object rather than any kind of electrical communication. And so, this last example kind of highlights my interest in how we can, through using these adaptive controllers for robots, design systems that have this interesting sort of collective capabilities, not through communication, but through contact with each other or contact with the environment. And this potpourri of topics and this whirlwind of a talk should, I hope, convince you that, adaptivity in robots are, I think, a very interesting topic and one in which you can get there through compliant structures and soft bodies that interact inherently with unknown environments and unknown objects through kind of dynamical principles like limit cycles and the kind of adaptive properties of these dynamical systems. And that contact interactions are really, really interesting, and they can be used in a really, I think, convenient way to coordinate the behaviors of robots. With that, thank you. I think there's time for questions too, if anybody has any questions, please.
Definitely time for questions.
Oh, definitely?
We're definitely good for questions. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. So if I can start, I had a question on the very last example. I saw you hit like the gamma values was like 0.6, 0.9, and then 1.2.
Mm-hmm.
But then the prior examples, you had like gamma of 1 was like your ideal target.
Mm-hmm.
Was there, like, did you see something happening at gamma of 1 that led you to try 0.9 instead? Or like this one here, like did something happen at the 1, like if gamma was 1?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. None of this I showed any, there might have been equations, I didn't say anything about them. But this gamma is basically over there. It's like the adaptive gain divided by the natural frequency. And with these robots, they all have a slightly different natural frequency because we might set them up with the same kind of like programmatic gains and stuff like that, but they're all mechanically different. So if we program 1 in there,
some of them will be
some
over.
of them are over. Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. So, yeah, thank you. Good. I mean, good catch. Honestly, I was about to say I don't know what the answer is. I should ask my student because I don't know. 1 worked for these other ones. I'm not quite sure what the difference was there. Any other questions? Yeah.
So going back to the insect wing beat, project, I'm very interested in this sort of really, really simple elastic, elastic girdle that you use. So from what I understand from discussing arthropods recently with our expert, when you're talking about an actual flying insect, there would be some sort of elastic response based on the flexing of the exoskeleton that might be happening here. Do you think that's I'm not sure exactly what part of the system this particular response was based on, but is that part of
this is
synchronization?
A very high level analog.
Right.
The structure, I don't actually know exactly what it looks like. It's called the scutum. It's basically like a base plate at the bottom of the exoskeleton under the body, but it provides this linkage between the left-right side. The exoskeleton too, I didn't say, but the muscles are actuating the whole exoskeleton, not the wing joints. It's what's called indirect actuation. So the whole exoskeleton is squishing like this, but there is this sort of critical junction between the two of them that if you remove it, they desynchronize. That this like X-shaped string is in no way meant to be like a literal, this is what the shape of that is, but the idea is just that it's this sort of mechanical coupling between left, right that is providing the synchronization. I don't know if I answered the question.
Yeah, just in a very general sense, I suppose, because I was thinking also about curvature based on your prior work, and that there's some
that would be a great connection in this talk to have a good through line of curvature. I did not think of that, and to be fair too, that work from the biology folks is just from other great researchers in insect flight, and so I just watched their videos and sort of got inspiration from it. Sure.
Oh, I just had a question about scale. Like, why did you choose to use a true fly versus a bumblebee versus like maybe something smaller like a thrip or a parasitic wasp?
Yeah, it's a great question. Your background in entomology is highlighted. So, what animal to choose? I have always been drawn to ants and bees in all of my research. I didn't show you anything with ants other than that picture in the very beginning. I do have research in my lab related to actual ant locomotion and collective behavior. Social insects are extremely nice for these experiments because if I take a social insect like an ant or a bee, just more generally, and I take their nest and I put it here and I put food here, I can get hundreds to thousands of them to go from their food to their nest in hours. And so if I set up a camera system and the perturbations that I want in between, it's a really robust way to collect observations of these kind of behaviors. Working with flies, is, I would say, more challenging. You have to get the behavior that you want, like go to food, is not necessarily as easy. How about that? Yeah, so bumblebees are great. You can order hives and you can set them up, and or you can go out and you can collect, right in your backyard.
Do you notice any differences in using insects that have two sets of wings versus flies where they have one pair and the halteres?
Yeah, it's a great question. Not for the kind of stuff that we've looked at, no. Yeah, so flies have halteres, a wing that was a wing that turned into a sensory structure. Bees have this sort of two pairs of wings on the left-right side without halteres. No, we haven't looked that far in depth. Yeah, great, thanks, good questions. Yeah.
So I think the last two were interesting presentations because essentially what I'm gathering is that you're saying that insects remove expensive perception and planning out of the loop from the brain, right? And so the body just has mechanisms to automatically deal with these.
Yeah, I wouldn't even, I don't know if it's so much about like expensive mechanisms for sensing, but they remove, they have inherently very fast processes just through the muscle. Because, a signal from a sensory neuron going through the brain back to motor can take a fair amount of time. People who study flies have shown that the responsiveness from detecting a change in the environment, like a fly is flying in a virtual arena and the virtual arena moves a little bit, that visual stimulus to change in wing beat control is like 80 milliseconds. I I mean, that's a long time compared to an individual wing beat, which is happening like at 5 milliseconds or so. So I think this provides a very quick response. Much like we have reflex responses that sort of don't go all the way up to our brain. They're maybe living in our like spinal cord, or maybe even at a very local level. Very quick responses. And so I think this is just an example of that. That a mosquito flaps its wings at 800 to 1,000 hertz. That's very, very fast. And so having the kind of flexibility within the muscle to respond to perturbations very quickly is, I think, advantageous.
So,
Second question, sorry. And then
so the second part to the question is more so. So I think that this implies that there is some kind of reliable actuation in insects, and then to some extent with the systems that you built. But robots are unreliable, right? Motors are unreliable. So my question is, how do insects deal with unreliable actuation or like these hard-coded mechanisms, and how do you see that being applied to your physical systems?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't actually know the answer to that. Like, because I think unreliability implies, I don't know, maybe there's some kind of inherent defect that causes a flaw. But
so I guess let me be more specific then. So over time, right? So a motor can have like a certain amount of life in it, right? And so over time, it just experiences wear and tear. And I'm not an entomologist, and so I don't know how that works with insects, but even our bodies kind of just go through wear and tear.
Yeah.
So how do insects essentially deal with that, and how can we apply that to physical systems?
Deal with, I don't know, but the responses that I would attribute to things that you're talking about, specifically flapping wing insects, the exoskeleton stiffens over time. Over the lifespan of an insect, exoskeleton stiffens. Wings suffer extreme wear, and the way that entomologists can measure the age of an insect in the field is like take a look at the wing and compare it to a sort of juvenile wing, and you can understand something about the age of it through how much wear it suffered. And the wing beat of insects over a specific insect over time increases. And so what I would say is this provides the kind of this method of actuation is just always responding to exactly what the properties of the body are. And so whether the muscle works or not, that's an aspect of unreliability that I have no idea about. But whether the muscle is actuating the body in the most effective way, that's my claim, that this kind of like low-level feedback process is always actuating the body at the natural frequency, as dictated by as what is the sort of most energetically efficient way to actuate the system. That makes sense?
Good.
All right, so we're a little bit out of time, unfortunately, but our speakers are going to hang around for a little bit longer. So if you have, I saw a couple other questions if you want to come up afterwards. We did get our speaker a bioinspired gift. This is a terrapin
Amazing.
turtle, our mascot. Round of applause.
Does everybody get one of these?
No, all the other speakers, we just throw tomatoes at them.
Thank you all very much, and I'm happy to take questions after.